Chapter 13 of your textbook is entitled Politics, and it begins with a discussion of suffrage and the suffrage movement. They note that the movement for women to gain the right to vote was uh, this was a long fight, beginning initially in 1848, and it involved a coalition of people pushing for women to achieve this right that at this time was largely limited to white men. And a good number of the suffragists came out of the abolitionist movement. And of course, that movement was focused on ending slavery. And so both men and women of color, as well as particularly white women, were involved in both of these movements. However, when slavery was ended by the 13th Amendment in 1865, and Black men were granted the right to vote in 1869 by the 15th Amendment, that decision to give suffrage to Black men over white women revealed, as your textbook indicated, some ugly divides within the suffragist movement, where there was a certain amount of racial animosity, between white women who were not yet provided the right to vote, and these newly freed slaves who were provided that right. And your book notes that this did lead to some Black suffragettes breaking off and forming their own organizations during this time period. Eventually, suffrage was granted to women by the 19th Amendment in 1920. And it's worth noting that uh, once women were given the right to vote, this did not mean that we had universal suffrage in the US at this time. Universal suffrage meaning, of course, the right of all citizens to vote. Because as your textbook noted, Native American men and women were still not permitted the right to vote. Their suffrage rights were granted a few years later. When we talk about feminism, which is where I'm going to focus my initial discussion for this chapter, it's worth highlighting the fact that when we talk about feminism in terms of waves, that suffrage movement is oftentimes considered the first wave of feminism. And it was a fairly narrow focus, as it was predominantly on the right to vote. However, certainly for some women, this was just kind of the awakening of their kind of political identities and their political activism, and they were interested in other rights that they felt women should have in the areas of education and employment. But for a lot of women that were suffragists, it really was just about this right to vote. And so that is why we see such a large gap between what we consider to be the first wave of feminism and what we will discuss in upcoming slides as the second wave of feminism. So what do I mean by feminism? This is a political movement that seeks the social equality of women and men. And, the feminist foundations for a lot of theorists can be traced back to kind of six general points that often come up in feminist theory and feminist writing as being significant to the ideology. The importance of gender, as opposed to sex, right? So, thinking about the distinction of those terms, where the focus really is on these kind of socially constructed categories and expectations that relate to sex categories, as opposed to, the kind of biological derived classifications we use for sex. The importance of equality, and equality across multiple sectors and institutions in private and public life. The importance of choice, the idea that women should no more be forced to be mothers as they should be to be, forced to be barren. They should not be forced into labor force participation, no more so than they should be forcibly excluded from it. The idea that women should have a broad range of choices, men and women should have a broad range of choices in terms of their personal and public and political lives. The importance of sexual freedom, the freedom to love who you want to love, marry who you want to marry. This is the part of feminism that oftentimes intersects with sexual identity and orientation. Activism against patriarchy, that it isn't just about interpersonal relations and dynamics between men and women, but we are interested in the institutional arrangements and policies that oppress people on the basis of gender. And then activism against gendered violence. This one is one that kind of rose out of the second wave of feminism, but still remains kind of at the forefront of a lot of discussions about, what are the goals of the feminist movement. And so with this increasing, popularity of feminism, with the kind of increasing visibility of people who claim the label and the tenets of feminism, it's just worth noting that there is a growing number of women, particularly younger women, who proudly proclaim that they are feminists. It's worth noting that some of those who say that they are feminists aren't quite necessarily ready to describe themselves as a feminist to other people. And we'll discuss more as to why that might be later in this video. And the number of men who say that they are feminists lags behind women, but as we're reaching almost half in terms of this particular study, that is promising. And once again, with men, even more significant gap between the number who say that they are feminists versus the number who then would proclaim the label to other people. Once again, maybe just kind of relating back to points that we've made, about, hegemonic masculinity and how it works and how it constrains men, and the extent to which men in contemporary society are gender policed, much more stringently than necessarily women are, in the ways in which that women have a little bit more behavioral freedom. So after saying that you are a feminist, most people just stop there. You perhaps were surprised, or, upon reading this chapter, that there are many different ways in which one can be a feminist. What type of feminist are you? And that distinction, that there are multiple ways in which one can be a feminist, that distinction arose or stuck out pretty clearly beginning in the second wave. So if the first wave of feminism is associated with the suffrage movement, then the second wave of feminism is oftentimes correlated with a book that was discussed in previous chapters, The Feminine Mystique, which was written by Betty Friedan. And if you recall, it was about this kind of the issues that middle-class white women had, that they were facing due to their limitations in public life. And being relegated to, the domestic sector. And Friedan referred to this as the problem that has no name. This kind of sense of unhappiness and lack of fulfillment. And so this was during the 1950s. And if you recall, a major criticism of this was that, this was largely targeted towards white and middle-class women, women who were racial minorities. Their problems as both women and racial minorities, those problems had names, and white women who did not benefit from class privilege, also clearly had, problems that intersected with gender in regards to their, financial instability. But in a lot of ways, second wave feminism was stamped by Friedan's book and by those concerns. And so if you look at some of the things that second wave feminists were most likely to be concerned on and focused on, equal pay for equal work, sexual harassment, and the redefinition of gender goals, certainly all of those things are very important. And the gains that they made, definitely were felt by women of all races and all stations. But these were the types of concerns that were most relevant for women who were both white and middle class. And amongst this group of feminists, what became clear was a very early divide between the group that we refer to as liberal feminists and the group that we refer to as radical feminists. So liberal feminists, they didn't want to overhaul the system. They wanted to reform it. They wanted women to have equal status, equal access, to the system as it existed. The institutions of work and the institutions of, education, government, they wanted women to have, equal access and equal rights under the kind of current system. Radical feminists took the much more radical approach that a system that was built upon, patriarchal ideals was never going to be adaptable and accessible to individuals who weren't cisgender men. And so therefore, they pushed for the system to be overhauled, to be resisted, to be torn down. If you've heard that burn down the patriarchy, that is the rallying cry of a radical feminist. Liberal feminists were not looking to burn down the patriarchy. They were looking to adapt and modify the patriarchy so that they as women could have a place within it. So you could see, right away that there was just this kind of divide between the two. And it's worth noting that, most historical evidence suggests that to the extent that women proclaimed a feminist identity during this time period, the 60s and the 70s, they were much more likely to be liberal feminists than radical feminists. However, in terms of media coverage and which type of feminism kind of dominated people's minds and imaginations, it was the radical feminists and their catchier slogans and their publicity stunts, that people associated with feminism. And in a lot of ways, what still shapes kind of people's kind of stereotypical perceptions of feminists even today. For the liberal feminists, what they really wanted and what was meant to be their grand achievement was the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. And, it's just worth noting that, this amendment was first proposed as early as 1923. It reached its greatest likelihood of passage, during the late 70s, but was ultimately not ratified by the necessary number of states in order for it to pass. So it failed. So it still doesn't exist today. That doesn't mean that the second wave of the feminist movement, particularly the liberal feminists, had no achievements. Your book in table 13.1 does a good job of outlining some of those feminist battles that were won for women and men in society. Things like the right for women to have a credit card in their own name, the right to an abortion, the banning of sex discrimination in schools, um, marriage bans, which prevented women from paid employment in certain careers, that was struck down. The decriminalization of birth control. Military academies were ordered to admit women. Women were permitted to serve on juries. So there are a lot of things that I think, we just take for granted as being things that everyone has access to, everyone has a right to. And it might be kind of surprising if you were to look at that list, table 13.1, how fairly recent some of those victories are. So coming out of the second wave of feminism, we have the third wave of feminism. And this is the 1990s. These are the sons and daughters of the second wave feminists, as well as people who were not feminists during the second wave. A big focus of the third wave was the concept of doing gender, which we discussed with Loiber, right? The idea that people, had the ability to push back and resist, gender norms, that people could cut their own deals, and can both uphold and reject kind of gendered expectations, kind of based on their own individual desires and preferences and wishes. So there was a big focus on women being women in different ways. This was also the first wave of feminism that really overtly embraced the idea, of intersectionality and the matrix of domination. That the idea that women are coming from different racial backgrounds, different class backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, and that all of this, of course, is impacting their experiences as women, and that feminism should attempt to address those kind of those kind of intersecting privileges and oppressions. This was also the first wave that explicitly embraced the concept of men as feminists, not just allies or sideline supporters of the movement. And maybe so unsurprisingly, it is the youngish men that were coming to age, and coming to adulthood during this time period, that this is the group of men that we see the kind of the largest acceptance and embracing of the feminist label among this group of men compared to previous generations of men. Obviously, not all men, and honestly, of course, not all women. There are anti-feminists who exist as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about them in an upcoming slide. But it's just worth noting that, especially with the rise of young millennials, and particularly Generation Z, concerns around the environment, concerns that are global and transnational. There are the use of social media to engage in activism. There is some argument being made that we are in the midst of a fourth wave. There are some people claiming that. And, I think if you've ever been to the ocean and you watched a big wave, crash in, sometimes it's when it then recedes back that you can really kind of be reflective on it, like, oh my gosh, that was a really big wave, now that it's receded. And I think that's what we see in society as well. It's sometimes extremely hard to recognize and characterize and classify something as a wave when you are in the midst of it, because you don't know how it's going to end. You don't necessarily know what characteristics about it, is making it, a unique classification. Some of those types of details become much clearer in hindsight. As I noted, regardless of what wave we're talking about, first, second, third, possible fourth, at no point in society has there ever been like this 100% acceptance and embrace of the feminist movement. Every wave has had its counterparts. And certainly, the anti-feminist counter movements that have been around, for the first, the second, and the third wave, have been pretty consistent. Usually it's the idea that feminists are, rejecting and disrupting the natural order of things. A lot of anti-feminists really embrace the idea of gender difference and that men and women are inherently different for one another, and those differences naturally should lead to different roles in society, in both the personal and the public sectors. Since the successes of the second wave feminists, since we've seen women gaining in certain areas of public life, particularly like higher education, for instance, there has been the rise of the feminist movement. This isn't just anti-feminist, it is making the argument that, there is this new kind of gender world order in which men are actually the oppressed and disenfranchised gender, that the gains that women have made in the last few decades have been to the detriment of men. For some people, it's not necessarily that they are anti-feminist or, even more specifically feminist, but that they have very negative stereotypes of feminism, the aims of feminism, as well as just who feminists are. Like I said, that the fact that for a lot of people, the stereotypical image of the radical feminists, that arose out of the 1960s, 1970s media, there's still that stereotype today, man hating, militant, unattractive, uh, you know, uh, refraining from, shaving body hair, wearing makeup, wearing dresses. There are people who still have those stereotypes about this is what a feminist is, despite, the proliferation of this is what a feminist looks like t-shirts, or the number of celebrities who, claim the feminist, label. There's still people that have those stereotypes. And so if you think about that, that might be why, there are these women and men who, despite saying they support feminist goals, don't claim themselves to be feminists, or they claim themselves to be feminists, but then they don't use that label when describing themselves to others, because there is still this concern around societal judgment and evaluation. So what does this mean for our chapter's topic? Well, the focus of this chapter was on politics, which is basically how power is acquired and exercised by certain individuals and groups within society. And that, politics, are the various activities that are involved when it comes to electing people to pass specific public policies that then impact all of our lives. So what does this mean if we then combine it with the concept of gender, the politics of gender? Well, it specifically means, how do people change and resist change to the gender order? Because the gender order is supported by our public policies. And therefore, if we change our public policies, then we can kind of change the gender ideology, the norms, the values that underlie society. And your book kind of describes, the types of policies that can either create or resist change as being what they refer to as feminist politics, which are efforts to make society's gender order less hierarchical, or anti-feminist politics, which are efforts committed to the value of gender difference and gender hierarchy and stratification. And so that's kind of a simplification, because I don't think necessarily very few people out there describe their politics in those types of terms. And even if you do describe your politics as being feminist politics, it's just worth noting that, a feminist utopia, what your book describes as being a perfectly gender egalitarian society, what exactly that utopia looks like is going to differ kind of based on your conception of feminism. Because moving, beyond time and the concept of waves, the types of feminists and their exact ideologies and positions can be dramatically different. Your book rattles off a long list of all the different types of feminists: socialist, libertarian, anarchist, eco-feminist, Black feminist, Chicana feminist, indigenous feminist, Muslim feminist, post-colonial feminist, separatist feminists, radical feminists, reformist feminists, transnational feminists. So people who call themselves feminists can still have very different ideas about how to solve the problem of gender inequality. And therefore, because they have different ideas about how to solve the problem, that means that their ideal world, their ideal society, their feminist utopia is also going to differ. And I really love that your textbook kind of describes feminism as a conversation as opposed to a set of positions. So it's not sufficient really to say someone has feminist policies versus anti-feminist policies, because even just saying that they have feminist policies, specifically what are those policies, and how are they suggesting that they be structured and imposed? Which brings us to the other big focus of the chapter, which isn't just politics, but governance. Because politics is about, the efforts to get people elected to pass public policies. Then governance is the process of making decisions for the nation, ensuring the state's accountability to its citizens and enforcing the laws of the land. And so when we refer to the state, head of state, the role of the state, these are the institutions entrusted with the power to regulate everyday life on the behalf of the group. So, basically the state is the government, and the act of governing is governance. So this chapter talks about governance in regards to gender in two ways, and they're catchy but easy to confuse. They talk about what they call the governance of gender, which is how the gender of citizens, how this shapes the ways in which they're regulated. So the types of policies that are passed, how are those policies gendered and how do they impact people differently based upon their gender? And then the gender of governance, which is a lot more straightforward. That's referring to who holds political office. And does it matter? So we're going to start with the trickier one, the governance of gender. So as your book notes, states enforce gender ideologies in a lot of ways. The most basic way is they decide how to recognize and classify gender. If your state, like most states, only recognizes the binary, your birth certificate, your driver's license, in a lot of different ways, they are consistently forcing you to classify yourself using those binary terms. Beyond classification, states also just decide, whether to require gender binary spaces. Think about the hubbub that surrounded so-called bathroom bills, the idea that bathrooms could be unisex or that bathrooms could be open to people based on how they identify and not the sex that was assigned to them at birth. So that is a policy that is shaping our access to certain spaces based on our gender. Other policies that gender spaces, relate to the separation of men and women's prisons, the separation of military, barracks, the combat laws that and other types of laws that used to exist in the military that distinguish kind of, what men and women in the military, what types of positions they could hold. All of that is a way in which governance of gender is occurring. Your book discusses other policies that differentially shape our lives based on gender. Some of those policies are related explicitly to reproduction. Obviously we can talk about reproductive rights and justice, court case Roe versus Wade that said that abortion was a constitutional right. But then in the last 2 decades, the deluge of legal and political challenges that have popped up in states, kind of chipping away at that right. Moving beyond reproductive justice, there are governmental policies that either encourage pronatal or discourage antenatal parenthood. We don't necessarily have explicitly pronatal policies in America, although you could say that some of our tax breaks maybe operate to a certain extent that way. And antenatal policies, of course, maybe one of the best known, was the one-child policy, later amended to be a 2-child policy in China. And similarly, although it wasn't as stringently enforced, India had something similar. Other types of policies that are gendered that we've talked about in this class, parental leave policies, the fact that we don't have a federally mandated paid maternity or paternity leave policies, discrimination policies. So we talked about in the work chapter, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the fact that it made discrimination on the basis of sex. It provided that protection, even if it has been hard to prove and enforce. We haven't talked about welfare policies, governmental assistance policies in this class, but specifically you can kind of think about the fact that when AFDC, assistance to families with dependent children, when that was changed by President Clinton in 1996 to TANF, temporary assistance to needy families. Of course, the impact that had on families, particularly families headed by single mothers, that is an example of a policy that is gendered and impacted people differently on the basis of gender. So there's a lot of ways in which governance of gender occurs. And your textbook notes that there are some feminists who want politicians to commit to what is called gender-aware policymaking, practice of carefully considering the likely effects of a policy on both men and women, as well as different kinds of men and women. And they give the example of the European Union, in particular, has embraced and instituted gender-aware policymaking. And now, as well as some of the programs in the United Nations. And so, the gender-aware policymaking, this could be things like, they said, the thinking about where do you place bus stops, because the needs of men and women are different when they commute to and from work. The one thing that's coming out of the pandemic is, learning, the extent to which a lot of working families were dependent on schools, and as being basically unpaid daycares. And when that option was removed, the dramatic impact that it's had on, families' day-to-day lives. So, gender-aware policymaking, perhaps we consider, how policies related to, the maximum hour work week, or, like I said, policies related to paid and unpaid leave, how they could have these differential impacts on individuals because of their gender. So when, besides committing to gender-aware policymaking, if you did want to create a more gender equal society, what does that look like? And this goes back to that point that everyone's feminist utopia doesn't look the same. And part of it has a lot to do with when people are trying to encourage and achieve gender equality, there's several different approaches that they can take. And so your book identifies the three kind of predominant approaches, and they note that most countries incorporate some policies that reflect at least one, if not all, of these approaches. So equal access. So this is, the approach that corresponds with liberal feminism. You're not changing the system, but you're trying to ensure equal access and equal treatment of individuals within the system, regardless of gender. And this is the predominant approach in the US. So, the main issue with this approach is that this approach reduces sexism, but it allows androcentrism and subordination to continue, because it doesn't encourage people to value femininity, because usually it's not men trying to get equal access to the jobs and the roles in society that are held by women. Usually it's women trying to gain access to the educational, career, military pathways that had been previously blocked to them. So it doesn't change, the devaluation of femininity at all. And nor does it promise that when women gain access, that they are going to be perceived the same way, that they're going to be given the same opportunities to succeed, because they might gain access and still experience the subordination that we've discussed in other chapters. So equal value is another approach. And this approach, it tries to increase the value of femininity, to raise it to the value of masculinity. And so they talk about this, and they give an example of Germany as a country that has some policies that place more emphasis on equal value than equal access. And so they talk about the fact that to encourage German women to stay home longer with their children and take the bulk of their maternity leave, they give a different type of payout versus if they did not stay and take the full leave. So they're basically trying to increase the value of the domestic sphere. The government is trying to increase the value of the domestic sphere. Other ways in which there could be equal value policies is, if a country, attempted to increase the prestige of female dominated occupations by setting aside, more money, or in some way trying to assign greater status to those occupations. That would be an example of an equal value approach. One issue with the equal value approach is it's rooted in that idea of gender difference, that men and women are different. And an assumption is that this difference is a source of pleasure, that men and women are different and they enjoy being different, and they don't want to be like each other. Men don't want to embrace femininity, women don't want to embrace masculinity. They just want their masculinity and femininity to be equally valued. So, of course, a major concern with the equal value approach is, while it does tackle androcentrism and subordination, it upholds this concept of the gender binary, and it upholds this idea that men and women are inherently different in ways that matter and are significant. The final approach is called equal sharing. And equal sharing actively tries to target subordination. And it does that by trying to encourage men and women to participate equally in positions that were conventionally understood as masculine and feminine. So it's trying to get men and women to equally do activities, occupations that have traditionally been labeled as being for one or the other. This approach is most common in Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, and your book emphasizes, it's common in societies that idealize the disappearance of gender as a meaningful category. Because if you are trying to encourage, like in Iceland, parents get 9 months of paid leave, but 3 months of these can only be used by the father. So it's basically trying to force men who maybe normally in a society that didn't have these types of policies, wouldn't take leave, or wouldn't take a significant amount of leave. It's trying to encourage them, to do so. And at the same time, encouraging, women to be in the labor force, and not necessarily feel as if they can't. And so that's what's meant by equal sharing. So, your book talks about, because feminists do not agree necessarily about what their feminist utopia looks like, different feminists will put forth different ideas in regards to those three approaches, or they'll put out ideas that pull from all three approaches. And this is why, that statement that feminism is a conversation to be had, not necessarily a clear statement of specific positions. That's kind of what makes that quote so meaningful. Now, moving to the gender of governance, which I said a lot more straightforward, and thus I can move through it a little bit more quickly, although I do have a lot more graphs. And admittedly, with the 2020 election just happening, and the number of mail-in votes and absentee ballots, really good data hasn't come out quite yet in regards to that election. We do have some information from, some of our early exit polls and early voting. Um, but that is why I chose to just kind of focus on the 2016 election. So, gender of governance. Let's first off start by asking who's most likely to vote. Well, women. Women outvote men in pretty much every type of election. Everything from your presidential elections to the elections that happen in non-presidential years, elections that are focused on local and state positions. Women are more likely to vote than they're more likely to vote than men. Another kind of significant gender divide that we see is that there is a gender gap in party preference, that women are, particularly women of color, are more likely to be Democrat, to vote Democrat, as opposed to Republican. For women who are white, it becomes a little bit more complicated, where whether or not they vote Democrat or Republican seems to be less about their gender and more about the interaction between gender and education, where white college-educated women were more likely, particularly if you're thinking about the 2016 election, were more likely to vote for Hillary Clinton, less likely to vote for President Trump. But you can see that even before that election, there had been this kind of gender gap in presidential voting, where women were more likely to support the Democratic candidate than compared to men. And that gap in terms of their identification and their voting habits, it was pretty consistent. It kind of began in the 80s, and has pretty much held in the last all of the presidential elections that came after that. Despite being more likely to vote, what women are not more likely to do is to actually hold political positions. We've obviously have never had a woman as president, but it's also worth noting that women lag behind men in both houses of Congress, the House of Representatives as well as the Senate. There are significantly less women who are governors of states, as well as mayors, particularly of large cities. When we look at state legislatures, there's a little bit more presence, female presence, but nowhere approaching parity. Once again, some of this does have to do with that gap between the Republican and the Democratic Party. For instance, if you were looking at the 113th Congress, the brightly colored depictions are the women. And you can kind of see that the number of Democratic women versus Republican women, there's almost 3 times as many. And, if you want to move past pictorial depictions to line graphs, you can just kind of see that the number of women who are Democrats in Congress and the number of Republicans or women Republicans in Congress, that gap has just increased. As recently as the mid 80s, the parties were pretty much the same. And then what you saw was a dip in Republican women in the early 90s. and they recovered, but they did not have a lot of significant gains in the number of Republican women holding office. While you see that beginning in the 1990s, the early 1990s, you start to see a steady increase of Democratic women holding these positions. Now, part of this has to do with organizationally, the Democrats did pursue female candidates and support female candidates um, much more overtly than Republicans did. And certainly one of the best known Democratic organizations related to fielding and supporting female candidates for public office for the Democratic Party was Emily's List, founded in 1985. And, you know, like I said, shortly thereafter in the early 90s, you start to see this dramatic increase in the number of Democratic women holding office. The Republicans did not really, you know, overtly embrace their kind of potential, their Republican female potential, you know, almost not until like within the last uh, 3 to 4 years, you know, kind of coming out of the last election. And so, you know, to the extent that they saw some gains, you know, in the 2020 election, you know, they're just kind of lagging far behind. And that's important because honestly, when you have a two-party system, a strong two-party system like we have in America, we are never going to get parity where we have an equal number of men and women in office if there continues to be this sizable gap between the two parties. And this is particularly true if you are thinking about it at the state level, because certainly, you know, there are more Republican state officers and you know, state senators. You know, that they do better. You know, they win more of those seats than at the national level. So, you know, if there is this gender gap that exists, particularly in the Republican Party, it's going to take us a while, you know, to kind of see a dramatic change in our numbers. So I'm just saying that there need to be, you know, more women who are Democrats and more women who are Republicans running for office and winning office if we want to see a real shift in the gender of governance. So, you know, just some facts. You know, thousands of women serve at the local level as mayors and council members. It's worth noting in most areas, they're still underrepresented compared to men. But the moment you go to the state and especially the national level, the numbers become much smaller. In 2018, 25% of state legislators were women, 6 of the 50 state governors were women, and only 24% of the members of the US Congress in 2019 were women. It varies by state. So this is looking specifically at legislative seats held by women, you know, at the state level. So there are some states where it's low, less than 20%, and there's some states where it's high, and high is considered to be 35%. And, you know, and so there are some trends. In general, the Western states have a higher percentage of legislators who are women. The Southern states have a lower percentage of legislators are women. If we, you know, expand our comparison to the rest of the world, you know, how do we compare? Well, the United States has never had a president who is a woman. But 27 countries currently have women as heads of the state. The first country to do so, the first country during the modern times to do so was Sri Lanka in 1960. 74 countries have had a woman in this position at some point in their history, in their modern history. Predominantly, a lot of them have been in Europe. But every region has seen at least one. And so, of course, if you consider it in this kind of, you know, this global comparative, you know, perspective, then it makes America's kind of, the fact that we have had none, it makes us stand out. And so, Pew Research has done back in 2017, they did a kind of focused look at this. If you wanted to check out that site, but they give you an idea of how that number has increased over time, beginning in the 1960s, going up to 2017, and then the kind of number of years that some of them spent in office. So what's going on in America? Why are we lagging compared to other countries in terms of gender of governance? What's holding back women from running for office? To explain this, we can kind of point to three factors. One of which is just prejudice. That people have these biases against female leaders, whether or not they think they're less tough, whether they think they're too emotional, whether they don't think they're as smart or as powerful. But certainly some people are just resistant to the idea of having and voting for a female leader, particularly president. And this is a 2011 Gallup poll, where you see, people say that they would vote for a woman. Only 6% would say they would not. So at least in terms of public opinion polls, it doesn't seem like prejudice should be the primary reason, why we see these disparities. Another factor could be sex role socialization, that compared to young boys, young girls are leadership qualities are not encouraged in them, that they aren't overtly pushed to take on these positions, to learn, how to campaign, to be able to, deal with, being publicly scrutinized or, failing, that they aren't, at a young age, kind of socialized and set up to have these experiences, which makes it less likely, not impossible, but makes it less likely that they then go on to embrace these opportunities and experiences as adults. And then the kind of final point is the structure of politics. The fact that for a lot of these positions, especially at the national level, that you are, available, to be in the state capitol, or, or to be in the nation's capital for a prolonged period of time, that sessions can, that they can, last long into the night, that it can involve irregular hours, that, when you aren't actually governing your campaigning. So you're spending a lot of time out of the home schmoozing and getting votes and getting people to financially support your campaign. And so that structure of politics, this expectation that it takes up all of your time, can, run against, particularly for middle-aged women, the other expectations about what they should be doing with their time, being a wife and being a mother. And so in this sense, it's very similar to, discussions that we had in regards to like CEOs, that the idea that by having this high position, whether it's in a company or whether it's in government, takes you away from family, which should be your primary focus. And of course, we don't raise these types of concerns when it comes to men, because the expectation is a man's going to have a family, but he is not the primary parent. Remember, he is the secondary parent. So for women, where the expectation is you are the primary parent, you are engaging in this intensive ideology of mothering, and that is the kind of primary way that you're being perceived and evaluated in society as a woman. Women who, have families that enter politics, are, sometimes, disparaged and looked down upon and negatively evaluated, for focusing on the public sector as opposed to their private domestic lives. And I just, in addition, of course, just facing like the sexism, and oftentimes really kind of sexist commentary, that men who are campaigning, don't necessarily experience in the same way. And as your book notes, addressing why women are not um, running for and winning political office in the same numbers as men, it is important because women's presence in politics disrupts all three types of inequality. Uh, it pushes back against the classic patriarchal rule that women cannot hold power, which is related to sexism. It disrupts the idea that power is inherently masculine, which is related to androcentrism. And, it disrupts men's prerogative to make decisions on behalf of women. Instead, you have women making decisions on the behalf of women. And, that is a disruption of subordination. And of course, that's assuming that it makes a difference. Do women in fact vote differently than men? And your book discusses this because, they say that, in a lot of ways, on a lot of issues, gender doesn't seem to make a lot of difference. That men and women who are part of the same party tend to vote largely similar. And because gender is just one social identity that people have, there's a lot of diversity among women. So sometimes women have more important things in common with other male legislatures than they do, with a female legislature. But there do seem to be other issues where the gender of the legislator does seem to make a difference. And your book talks about that in regards to like support for peace. They talk about it in terms of environmental causes, that oftentimes, particularly female politicians vote differently than men on issues that affect their female constituents. And these could be things like social welfare, women's health, family-friendly workplaces, education. So it isn't just that having more women in office is about symbolic representation, but that it does seem to, at least somewhat, translate into substantive representation. That having women in office does impact the policies that are brought up. It does impact the policies that are enacted and passed. And they kind of highlight, a good example of this by telling the story of, Tammy Duckworth, who is a veteran. She's the first disabled woman elected to Congress. But in 2018, she also became the first sitting senator to give birth. And so she brought her baby with her to the Senate chamber, in order to take part in a vote. And this was something that they never had to consider because, it had primarily been men. And of course, there would be no reason, that a man would have to necessarily bring in his newborn to the Senate floor. And to the extent that, that there had been women, before Duckworth, a good number of those women, because of the structure of governance, they were older. They had to wait until, their children were out of the house, and they had this time to give to the public sector because of the expectation that, when they had young children, that they were supposed to be in the home. So, Duckworth, this story is significant because it shows that, when you have women in these positions, it forces institutions to consider how policies impact women, and it allows the people who are impacted, by these policies, in this case, the mother of a newborn, to be able to actively weigh in. So this is just one example how it's not just about symbolic representation, how it can in fact translate to substantive representation. So we are there are a lot of arguments that can be made, therefore, about why it's so important that we have gender diversity, as well as racial diversity, as other religious diversity in our governing bodies. Certainly, one political position where we have not had a lot of diversity of hardly any type is president. And after, of course, the election of Barack Obama in 2008, we got some racial diversity in our presidential, our history of presidents, but we still have not had, as I've noted, a female president. And your textbook kind of offers their explanation as to why. That, in the US, the family is the dominant metaphor for the state. And so if the state is the household, the president's the head of the household. And traditionally, who do we think of as being head of the household? A man. The US president has been called at times the most masculine job in the nation, right? Because we think, we discuss it in terms of, their need to, protect the country, be tough, and rule with a firm hand. And so because we think about this job in this masculine type of light, that often means that candidates, when they're running to be considered as presidential candidates, their masculinity becomes a key component. Your book talks about this, how we saw this play out in the 2016 Republican primaries, that, there was a lot of posturing about, who could be unapologetically masculine. And they talk about particularly for Donald Trump, who of course went on to win the Republican primary and then to win the 2016 election. He engaged in what we've discussed previously, exculpatory chauvinism, where bad behavior was explained away as being inherently masculine, and so therefore these traits that objectively could be viewed as bad or less desirable were instead presented as being masculine. And if you want a masculine president, then you have to be willing to kind of suck up the negative or bad masculine traits that go along with that. And so your book offers kind of an interpretation of the 2016 election through a gendered lens. And I encourage you to kind of read through those ideas. Some of these arguments I'm more accepting of than others, but it certainly kind of presents an example of how one could offer a gendered analysis of a presidential election, particularly since that election, involved the first female candidate of a major party. Of course, because Hillary Clinton was running as the Democratic candidate that year. But the result is she did not win, and so thus America still remains a country that has never had a female head of state. Before I close this chapter with some additional material, I just would like to note that the social movement material, pages 376 to 386, I'm going to save for our final chapter, chapter 14, because I like to end my courses, or at least most of them, with a discussion of social movements and social change. And because chapter 14 is a relatively light chapter in terms of pages and material, and I felt like this chapter was already dense enough, I am just going to save that material for that time. But what I would like to add is some material from a supplemental reading that I used to assign. And it was about shattering the glass ceiling for women in politics. And the big question highlighted in that reading was, how do we boost women's presence at all levels of government? And so they talk about, why do the gender gaps in in holding political office. Why do these gaps exist? It can't be because women don't care about politics or voting, because as I noted, women have consistently, outvoted men in elections, as far back as the 80s. And it doesn't necessarily seem that it is a gap in ambition, or at least not a gap in early ambition, because they note that, when you're looking at little children, oftentimes, young girls are running for class president at equal numbers as young boys, at least before puberty. And then we start to see a shift that happens in middle school, high school. And by the time we get to college, there is this, disparity between the number of student body presidents who are men versus the number of student body presidents who are women. And then, of course, it just grows from there. We've already discussed, the disparities that exist at the local, state, and national level when we're talking about public office. So the suggestions that this reading offer is that, women need to be asked to run early and often. And since Emily's list, there have been a lot of nonprofits, some are partisan, some are nonpartisan, that have popped up, encouraging the mobilization of potential female candidates for political office. Groups like She Should Run, groups like Ask Her, which also kind of became they ran a viral hashtag campaign, around making that ask. The reading suggests that, we need to establish a presidential commission on gender and inclusive democracy, that this is something that we should study more, and, we should, figure out how to address, because as I stated, it's not just symbolic representation. It does, have the capacity and the ability to result in substantive representation. And so for that reason, it is important. And some of these disparities could perhaps be addressed by changes in policy related to campaigning and or governance. So think about the Tammy Duckworth example. And then finally, political parties should take stronger action. And so I did note that one thing that came out of the 2018 midterm elections, which saw a lot of Democratic women run and win, increasing the disparity between the number of female Democrats and Republican Democrats in Congress. One thing that did come out of that was the National Republican Party did earmark more resources for recruiting and running more female candidates for the Republican Party. And they did have some successes in the 2020 elections. So there will be some new Republican women going to Congress. And like I said, and regardless of what side of the aisle you fall on, this is significant because, as I noted, in a two-party system, we are not going to reach gender parity if all of the women are only being elected from one side. And so this is something that both political parties should take more seriously. And it's just worth noting that, in the last 2 years, we have now reached the point where, you've seen both parties making more of a concentrated effort, not just to win the female vote, but to actually run, to recruit and support and run female candidates. And so that is it for chapter 13.